Garrett Ward tugged on the reins as the old horse stopped. Before him, 3 motionless bodies lay sprawled on the cracked red earth. The desert wind blew through his dusty coat, catching the edge of a dark silk tunic and blowing the long black hair of a young woman whose face was buried in the ground. Garrett stood still, his hand on the butt of his gun, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was no sign of an ambush, no sound of chasing horses, just sun, sand, and silence. But he knew in this land, silence was sometimes the most dangerous sign. He slid off the saddle, walking slowly. The first body he touched was an old woman, her face etched with the lines of a long, hard journey. Her hands were cold. He pressed his fingers to her neck, but there was no pulse. He paused, a flicker of a memory passing behind his eyes, then moved to the other 2. They were girls, almost identical, their faces pale beneath the dust, their arms bleeding from scrapes and cuts. One of them still clutched a shard of broken pottery. He bent down, pressed his hands to their necks. Both were alive, the pulses faint but clear. This could be a trap, he knew. But if he turned away, they would die before the sun set. Garrett drew his knife, not to cut ropes, but to gently clear the dust from their faces. He lifted them onto his horse one at a time, the weight of their frail bodies a familiar burden. He was shouldering a responsibility he hadn't asked for. On the way back to the farm, Garrett said nothing. No one saw, but he knew. He had crossed a line. From here, there was no turning back. The crackling of the fire in the hearth was not enough to warm the cabin. The 2 girls lay against the wall, each wrapped in an old blanket. They were still unconscious when Garrett cleaned their wounds, bandaging them with rags torn from old shirts. He did not sleep that night. Gray eyes watched the door, and the gun was within reach. Near dawn, the first to stir was a girl he would later know as Leanne. She opened her eyes slowly, as if the light hurt more than her wounds. When her dark, almond-shaped eyes met Garrett's, she jerked upright, a gasp catching in her throat. She said something sharp and fast in a language he didn't understand, waking her sister. The other twin, Mai, sat up, her eyes like polished obsidian. She pulled her sister behind her, a protective shield. "Don't come any closer," Mai hissed, her English clipped but clear as she reached for a log of firewood. "You're in a safe place," Garrett said slowly, not moving. "I didn't bring you here to harm you. If you want to leave, the door is open." The 2 of them looked around the rustic cabin, then at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. They did not seem to believe him. "Who are you?" Mai asked, her voice strong. "Just a landowner," Garrett said, placing a bowl of water near the fire. "I found you in the desert." "Nobody would save 2 Chinese girls in the desert without a reason," Leanne whispered, her gaze flicking from Garrett to the door and back again. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," Garrett replied. "Rest." Leanne pulled the blanket closer. Mai glared at Garrett, her hand still gripping the log. It was Leanne who was the first to bend down, dipping a rag in water and wiping the blood from her own wrist. "Do you have any medicine?" she asked, not looking at him. "Only whiskey." Garrett set the small bottle down. Leanne took it without saying thank you. The silence was as heavy as dust on the cabin window. For a moment, Garrett felt like an intruder in his own home. Mai stood up and stumbled toward the door. "We will go," she said. "Going out there at this hour is a sure death," Garrett warned. "Better to die out there than be trapped in here," Mai shot back. Before she could push the door open, Leanne spoke. "If I wanted to die, sister, I would have died in the desert." Mai paused. She turned to look at Leanne, her eyes losing some of their sharpness. No one said anything more. The night wind crept through the wooden walls, carrying a bit of dry sand. Leanne sat with her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on Garrett as if trying to read an unspoken answer. Garrett left the cabin, leaving the 2 women inside. He sat on the porch steps, his hand still on his gun. Not because he was afraid of them, but because he knew they were used to living as if the whole world was their enemy. The first light of day filtered through the wooden door, falling silently on the cold ground. Inside the cabin, Leanne let out a soft groan. She was no longer as frightened as last night, but her face was still swollen. Beside her, Mai had woken up early. She was gently unwrapping Lian's hand, examining a long gash on her forearm. Mai sat still, her eyes fixed on the door. "No infection," Lian muttered, readying the bandage. "A sharp rock in your hand means you're alive." Garrett entered, holding a black iron pot. "Corn porridge." "Enough for 3 inch," no one answered. He ladled portions into bowls and placed them on the rough wooden table. Lian was the first to stand. She walked slowly, each step a measure of her apprehension. When she sat down, she did not eat, just looked at the bowl, and then at Garrett. "Why did you save us?" she asked, her voice low and dry. Garrett did not answer immediately. He sat down on the bench. "Some things don't need a reason." Lian bowed her head, scooping up the first spoonful. Tears fell immediately after. Not from pain, not from hunger, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt a sliver of safety. Mai turned away, looking out the door, but then quietly took her portion. Outside, light fell on the broken fence. Garrett stood up, put on his coat, and walked out. The cabin was quiet again, except for the sound of spoons hitting bowls. At noon, when Lian went to the water tank behind the house, she stopped suddenly. On the sand next to the broken fence were footprints, not Garrett's nor theirs. The feet were shod in soft-soled slippers. The path was winding. Mai stepped out and saw Lian's eyes frozen to the ground. "Someone was here last night," Lian whispered. "He is still looking for us." The two returned to the cabin, saying nothing more. But from Mai's gaze, for the first time, Lian no longer felt alone in her fear. Garrett returned before sunset, carrying a canvas bag containing a few tin cans and some bullets. "Nothing strange south," he said. "But west, there are old campfires." No one was surprised. The silence was a confirmation. Danger was coming not from inside the cabin, but from outside. As darkness enveloped the distant hills, Garrett lit the oil lamp. Mai was checking Lian's wound while Lian sat silently by the door, turning over an old cloth. Suddenly, there was a dry thump sound outside the porch. Both girls jumped. Garrett hurried to the door, gun in hand. Stabbed into the doorpost was a small, sharp knife. Tied to its handle was a strip of red silk. Not to kill, but to warn her. Mai stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "A sign of the dragon's fang," she said, her voice a low growl. "It's how he marks what belongs to him." Garrett pulled the knife out, clutching it in his hand. "They came so close that no one heard them." "They are used to the night," Lian said, her voice quiet as ash. "We were once part of that shadow." No one needed to say more. Tonight was not a night for sleep. Garrett put the gun on the table, then looked at the two of them. "We need to assign guards." "I'll take the first shift." "No," Mai said. "I'll take the first watch." "I've rested too much." Garrett looked at her, not objecting. He handed her the old pistol. "Not loaded. Only pull the trigger when you're sure." Understood. When everyone settled, the cabin was as silent as a graveyard. Outside, Mai sat on the porch, the moonlight highlighting the sharp, determined lines of her face. A moment later, Lian emerged, a small cup of water in her hand. "Can't sleep," she said softly. "Not used to watching anyone but myself," Mai replied. Lian put down the water, then sat next to her sister. "Fear is a luxury we cannot afford," Lian whispered. "But not being afraid is stupid." Mai's lips curled slightly, almost a smile. "I've never had the chance to be stupid." They sat silently side by side. On a distant hilltop, a fire flickered. A sentry post or a threat? No one knew. When the coyotes howled for the first time, Mai entered the cabin. Garrett was already awake, holding his long gun. He looked at her, then nodded. No words were needed. In front of the door, the knife with its red ribbon was still lying on the table. Although Garrett had intended to throw it away, Lian silently held it. She placed it in a crack in the wall, a reminder of who was watching them. The next afternoon, the air was heavy. The wind had stopped. Garrett was repairing the gate when the sound of horses came. The first three to appear were hatchet men, their faces grim, their hands resting on the handles of axes tucked into their belts. Behind them came an older man on a fine black stallion. He wore a dark silk jacket, a long, thin braid trailing down his back. Garrett did not enter the cabin. He stood in the middle of the courtyard, his long gun in his hand but unraised. Behind the cloth curtain, Mai and Lian watched in silence. "I am Master Wei," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "The two in your house are my property. They broke a contract. Give them back, and there will be no trouble for you." Garrett did not answer at once. Sweat dripped from his temples. He turned and opened the cabin door. "Do you want to go?" he asked. Lian stepped forward first. "We have nowhere to go back to," she said, her voice even. Mai followed, unarmed, just her clenched fists. "If you want to take my life, try." And Master Wei looked at them as if they were two stray dogs. They betrayed their word, their duty. They are no longer worthy of protection for refusing to be sold like cattle, Mai shot back. For running from a cage, one of the hatchet men growled. They are unclean. Garrett stepped forward, blocking the two. They are here because I cannot let anyone die in the sand. If it is their fault that they survived, it is mine. You do not understand our ways, rancher, Master Wei said, his eyes darkening. I don't need to understand, Garrett replied. I only know right from wrong. The silence stretched like a taut rope. Finally, Master Wei tilted his head. 3 days. If they are not gone, we will come back. And next time, we will not use words. He turned his horse. The men rode away, leaving a faint trail of dust. As they disappeared, Garrett turned back. 3 days, he repeated. So there's still time, Lian said, her voice unshaken. Time for what? Garrett asked. My walk to the gate, her hand on the warm wood. Time to prepare. So that I don't die like a fugitive. Garrett nodded. He went back into the house, took out a Winchester that had not been oiled for a long time, and placed it on the table. 3 days wasn't for begging. It was for preparation. The first morning after the ultimatum passed quietly. Garrett had boiled water early. When he poured it into a tin cup, the clanging of metal echoed in the still air. Lian was the first to rise. She went to a corner, quietly folding the used blanket, smoothing out the edges. When she finished, she sat down, her hands clasped. Mai came after. She took the only knife with an intact blade and began to sharpen it on a stone, the rhythmic scrape a sound of grim determination. Garrett stood on the porch. When the two of them stepped out, he said nothing. I won't stop anyone, he said. The gate is unlocked. We know, Lian replied. I won't keep anyone, but if you stay, I won't back out when they come back. Mai finally looked at him, a strange, bitter humor in her eyes. Why would you do this for us? We are just two women alone. Everyone knows we can't live without a man. She said the words with a sharp, sarcastic edge, mocking the world that had tried to chain them, mocking the weakness they were supposed to feel. Garrett met her gaze. Maybe I'm not doing it for you. Maybe I'm doing it for myself. My sarcastic smile faded. Lian stepped forward and took the knife from her sister. If we stay, we learn to live. Garrett closed the gate as gently as if it were an old door. From now on, this place would not be a stop, but a home. That morning, Garrett dragged old sandbags from the shed. Mai shouldered them as if she were carrying the anger that had burned her. Sweat soaked through her tunic, but she didn't complain. Lian carried heavy planks of wood, her shoulders set. When she held the hammer, her hand shook, but she didn't drop it. You're holding it wrong, Garrett reminded her. Lian corrected her grip. The hammer struck the nail a second time, more firmly. At noon, when they took a break, Lian sat against the base of a pillar, her sleeves rolled up. Faint scars and bruises were visible on her arms. They called us swallows, she said absently. Meant to fly across the sea, only to be caged. Mai gave a short, unhappy laugh. I was called a traitor because I broke the nose of the man who bought me. Garrett said nothing. He just placed another stone on the newly patched fence. Their stories did not need pity, just to be told once. By evening, the sound of hammers echoed as if to warn anyone watching. This place was no longer soft. As the sun cast long shadows, Garrett went behind the well. Leanne followed, holding the newly sharpened knife. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Yes," Garrett replied. "Only fools aren't afraid." "But I fear losing myself more than I fear death," Leanne nodded. "I think I died once already on the ship. This time, if I die, at least I die knowing who I am." Garrett looked at her longer than usual. "Then you're alive." Night had fallen and the fire burned higher. Every window had been boarded up. The cabin not only kept out the wind, but also the feeling of not belonging. For the first time, it felt like a home. It was not yet light, but the sound of horses was already rumbling from the foot of the hill. The group had not come to negotiate today. Garrett was already standing on the porch, his Winchester cleaned. More than a dozen men surrounded the farm. They did not come for a fight, but for a final declaration. Master Wei sat on his horse in the center. He did not speak to the women, but to the world. These two have forsaken their heritage. They have no family, no name. They are ghosts, lost between worlds, belonging to no one. Leanne stepped forward. She did not bow. "I will not return to a place that does not allow me to live." My step beside her. "I did not betray anyone. I just chose not to belong to you." Master Wei looked at Garrett. "You accepted them, and their fate is yours. They are ghosts, and your house is now a tomb." He turned his horse and rode away, his men following. They had not come to attack, but to pronounce a social death sentence. As the sound of hooves faded, Garrett watched the two women walk toward the cabin. No one turned, no one cried. They had lost their names, but they had regained the right to define themselves. That afternoon, the sky changed color. Thick clouds rolled over the hilltops. As the first drop hit the tin roof, Leanne was the first to step into the yard. She reached out, catching the cool drop. It touched her skin, sliding along an old scar. Water, once a rationed luxury, now fell freely. Mai said nothing, just took off her scarf, letting the rain wash away the dust. Garrett stood at the back, looking out into the yard where the two women were no longer hiding. They let the rain wash away the fear. As water trickled down the porch, Leanne raised her face to the sky, her eyes closed. She no longer thought about the cage she had escaped. "I never saw rain after I was chosen," she said. Garrett was silent. Years ago, when he lost his family, he thought he would spend the rest of his life in land as dry as ashes. But now the water was flowing. And it was not just watering the land, but also softening memories. That night, for the first time, no one lay guard, not because the enemy had given up, but because they no longer saw themselves as victims. They chose to stay, and the rain, like a blessing, chose to fall at the right time. The rain had ceased by dawn. The earth, softened by the downpour, gave way under Garrett's boots. He rose early. The Winchester lay where he'd left it. He stepped outside, carrying a bucket and his resolve. Mai was already out, carrying an old shovel. Leanne came next, balancing a small woven basket filled with seeds. Garrett handed Leanne a bowl of corn porridge. She accepted it. The gesture meant more than food. It was a promise. "Here, you will be fed. We'll plant the first row today," Leanne said. "If the seeds crack, we'll have hope." "Hope is a good start," Mai added, her voice low but firm. Leanne knelt, pressing seeds into the earth. Garrett watched as she wetted each mound until the soil glistened. They worked through the day, repairing the roof, sealing cracks. Mai climbed ladders, hammered boards. Garrett held nails. Leanne mixed mud and clay. The sun slid toward the west. Garrett pulled out an old wooden chest, revealing scraps of cloth. "Here," he said, handing a piece of canvas to Leanne. "Make us bags for the seeds." Under her slow fingers, she sewed stitch by stitch, rebuilding not just fabric but dignity. Mai found a whistle inside the chest. She blew on it, and the notes crackled, weak at first, then clearer. For a moment, the whistle's tone cut through the labor, reminding them of something long forgotten. Garrett nodded. There was music here after all. They ate together under the pale evening light. Leanne told of her mother's lullabies. My recalled nights before their voyage when she'd fall asleep hearing the river. Garrett sat back, watching the figures of the two women. They had worked until their hands were raw, but they had built something steadier than walls. A hope that this place could become a home. Leanne, wiping her brow, looked at Garrett. When those seedlings grow, she said, we'll know we're alive. Mike cracked a small smile. Alive? Yes. And not just surviving. Night came soft, not with fear, but relief. In that night, as the stars watched, they all slept. Not as fugitives, not as unwanted ghosts, but as people who had chosen to stay. Dawn broke slow, golden. Garrett stood at the door, his eye sweeping the yard, the repaired roof, the fortified fence, the small seedlings peeking from the soil. He watched my measuring wood. Leanne was at the well. They had come not just to stay, but to belong. He took a breath and called out, breakfast inside. They gathered at the table. They ate in silence at first, but then Mai broke it. She held up a piece of bread. To mornings that don't demand fear, she said. Leanne smiled. After breakfast, they moved outside together. Leanne knelt at the small garden. This will be food, she said. Not just for now, yes, Garrett nodded. By afternoon, the heat pressed in. Under the wide porch roof, they all paused, breathing in the moment. Tomorrow we build the chicken coop, Garrett said, a smile on his face. And then the smokehouse. Mai chuckled. Smokehouse? Already thinking ahead, Leanne nodded. We have to plan for seasons, not just days. Late in the day, Garrett retrieved a small carved wooden symbol Leanne had made, 2 intertwined circles. He placed it on a ledge above the door. A promise that said, here we stand. As dusk fell, they gathered on the porch steps. 2 women and 1 man, side by side. The sky deepened. Stars emerged. I used to think sunset meant the end, Leanne whispered. But now, Mai added, it feels like a promise of sunrise. A chance Garrett drew in the scent of wood, smoke, and earth. He thought of all they had lost, but also all they had reclaimed. Strength, choice, home. Later, when the moon was high, they went inside. Laughter came, small and gentle, over a shared joke. They spoke of legends from a land across the ocean, of childhood songs, of hopes for the coming winter. Garrett lay back on his cot, hearing the wood of the house settle around them. He closed his eyes, thinking, here I found purpose. Here they have found themselves. Here the land holds promise again. And in the silence of that ranch, with night pressing gently against the window panes, no one felt alone. There's a certain silence that falls not of absence, but of peace. In the quiet aftermath of struggle, when hands are no longer clenched in defense, but open to creation, people find what they were truly searching for all along. Not just survival, but a place to belong.